Dee Recorder. Good afternoon, everybody. It's 1:30, time for us to start. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this very important webinar that I'm very happy to host from the European Parliament here in Brussels. This webinar, which I hope you will enjoy, is the third episode in my policy series, which cover an array of different topics, but mostly will focus on energy and climate change. Previous episodes have detailed Ireland's exciting potential for green hydrogen, as well as the unnecessary plight suffered by women and girls, in particular at the hands of the Taliban. Renovation of the EU's building stock is a key Green Deal priority. But since this designation, the landscape in Europe has changed. We have faced and overcome the worst pandemic in 100 years, the economic consequences of which will have lasting implications, but also a war on our doorstep that has fundamentally changed the trajectory of the energy transition and caused a crisis in security of our energy supply. This has caused inflation to skyrocket and soaring energy prices for consumers, significantly affecting millions of EU citizens, businesses and the economy more broadly. However, in reacting to the crisis, we must not trade one dependency for another. The war poses an immediate and acute danger that will require a comprehensive and cooperative approach from the international community. To reduce dependency on fossil fuels, particularly gas, it is clear that further action is needed to reduce buildings' energy consumption. A massive scale-up in renewable energy in power generation, industry, buildings and transport will accelerate our phasing out of Russian fossil fuels. It will also, over time, lower electricity prices and reduce fossil fuel imports. Buildings are responsible for 36% of greenhouse gas emissions and 40% of the energy consumption in the EU. It is clear they need to be sufficiently addressed if we are to reach our climate targets. There is no question of that. As the main EU-level instrument for decarbonising member states' building stock, the Energy Performance of Building Directive will soon take centre stage. The Solar Rooftop Initiative, a core element of the REPowerEU plan unveiled, includes a proposal to be added to the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive that will make solar rooftop photovoltaic panels much more integrated into households, businesses and the energy system. I represent the Parliament's largest group, the European People's Party, in the negotiations of the EPPD. In my amendments to this legislation, I included a new article to address the rooftop initiative. Of course, solar generation capacity differs across the Union, and Member States should have sufficient flexibility to operate support schemes. Nonetheless, the technology has advanced to the point where it is also a viable solution for Northern Europe as well as the sunnier south. Rooftop solar PV, in a sense, is a low-hanging fruit if we want to see a swift and cost-effective ramp-up of green power capacity. Approximately half of the energy consumed in Europe is used for heating and cooling. Most of this is based on fossil fuels. Solar heating and cooling technologies can displace the need to use natural gas, protecting consumers from fluctuating energy prices. In Ireland, 1 million homes have the roof space and orientation suitable for the installation of up to 10 solar panels. This translates into 8% of Ireland's renewable energy target and could save each household approximately €450 in electricity costs per year. Ireland may have more than its share of cloudy days, but the reality is that solar generation will play a big role in reducing emissions for countless households. By taking advantage of unused roof space on sheds, farmers can incorporate a new revenue stream by selling excess generation back to the grid. This is a win-win investment. We have an excellent set of speakers who will address different issues in relation to solar generation in Ireland, and I look forward to hearing their expert analysis. So thank you all for tuning in. And now I am happy to introduce our first speaker, Conall Bolger, CEO of the Irish Solar Energy Association. Conall has 16 years of markets and policy experience working across the energy value chain, from community and customer side projects to larger scale onshore and offshore wind development. So over to you, Conall, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and delighted to be here. If you could bring up the slides, please. So I'm going to give just a little bit of an overview of where solar is in Ireland generally, and talk, next slide please, talk through probably briefly three areas that are kind of key here, really around the kind of supports that are available, planning and grid, and getting onto the network, which are kind of three important areas. Next slide please. So, is that coming on? Next slide, please. Okay. So a big part of the changing landscape has been the Irish government have put in place a target this year for solar PV, which was a doubling of the previous target. And that has moved, that really kind of reflects probably 2022 being something of a transition year for the industry. With in our renewable auction, next slide after that please, about nearly 80% of the awarded capacity, the utility scale projects were awarded to solar in our kind of the CFD style auction mechanism. Residential customers were eligible to be paid for power they export themselves from the 1st July. And there's kind of series of measures coming for farms, businesses and community organisations later this year. Next slide, please. As we're kind of currently at a stage where there's tens of thousands of customers connected with rooftop solar in Ireland. So we're really kind of very much at an early stage. And the numbers cited in the introduction of the 1 million rooftops, that's on the next slide, please, come from a study we commissioned earlier this year from University College Cork. And something that was very striking about the numbers in that was that we could produce a quarter of all residential demand from a relatively small set of systems if they were installed on those rooftops. So there's very much a lot of potential here. And really, I suppose that the remainder of my presentation is really about the kind of measures that are coming in place now, really, to kind of help achieve some of that potential. Next slide, please. And I think the one after that as well. So the kind of first big bit really is around the kind of supports that are being put in place. Firstly, the organisation that Fergus works for kind of administer a set of grants under what is called the Microgeneration Support Scheme. So this is support with the upfront costs of the systems. And what we're also seeing then is that this is supplemented by the energy bill savings that people are seeing, that are obviously coming through in the context of high prices generated by the Ukrainian war. It's something to note in that research that was produced about the 1 million rooftops. They predicted for that relatively a 10-panel system a bill saving of €450 per year. On current energy prices, that's closer to €600 per year. So it's pretty substantial. And the final kind of third leg of that stool really is the kind of payments for export, which are now available from the 1st July and are going to be backdated to February in most cases. So the kind of at the residential scale, we're kind of seeing a kind of framework, a series of framework of measures that are relatively clear. The non-residential structures, so these are kind of farms, businesses, communities, we're kind of probably clear on the structures, but in terms of the actual numbers, what that's going to look like, we're probably still waiting for a little bit more of that detail. That's also been supplemented by another government policy around small scale generation policy. So this is looking kind of at filling in the gap for between the kind of micro generation and the kind of utility scale. So kind of payments for kind of sub 1 megawatt rooftop units, and then looking to encourage utility scale, community owned and small to medium enterprise owned projects. Next slide, please. Something that has been a constraint until Friday last week actually were the planning requirements for rooftop solar. So the picture on the right hand side would show you your standard residential system would have been something around 6 or 7 panels, because historically on a residential basis your limits were if you were trying to install a system larger than 12 square meters or 50% of the roof area, planning permission was required. That is now being removed. So they're all exempted from planning permission requirements as of the 7th of October, so Friday last week. And within in the non-residential space, if your system is greater than 300 square meters within what's called a solar safeguarding zone, then you need to go for planning permission, but otherwise you're largely planning exempt. So this is really reflecting a big opening up of our kind of what have been heretofore relatively restrictive planning conditions and requirements. And my final slide, please. And the last piece really is around the kind of the networks piece. So we have a relatively restrictive set of routes to get onto the network. And what's probably noted is that the kind of microgeneration piece and the ECP, which is our utility scale, how you get onto the network from a utility scale or greater than 500 kilowatts, they're relatively established and relatively kind of well understood. We have 2 new pilots coming through for what they're calling mini generation and kind of small scale generation. So that, again, trying to give the kind of missing elements in the kind of wider rooftop portfolio, their physical route to connect to the system. I suppose really the 2 points we'd make really quickly on those are, firstly, there's pilots, so they're time limited and there's not a lot of batches available. And I suppose there's a lot of restrictions around people being able to export, which probably means that people are going to install smaller systems than might otherwise be the case. So I've just taken a quick canter through the kind of landscape, and I think Fergus and Barry will probably dig into the detail a little bit more on some of the dimensions of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel. That was, am I connected? Thank you, Colonel. That was most interesting, and you raised 1 or 2 points which will be hopefully expanded on as we go forward. And also I think it's very encouraging that so much progress has actually been made in Ireland, both at government level and at local level, to ramp up solar energy. So to elaborate further now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. And our next speaker is Fergus Shapley, who is Head of Business Supports and Transport at SEAI, who do a pile of this work. Fergus has experience in providing a range of supports to help business transition to clean energy, as well as supports for electric vehicles and charging. So, over to you, Fergus, away you go.
Thank you. And I'll ask to get my slides up as well, please. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you today and bring you some of my thoughts on this. I'm going to try and show where we're going and what we've done, but also show some of the, I suppose, the pitfalls related to solar PV. And it's an interesting technology from a policy perspective, because you could argue it's a building retrofit technology. You could also argue it's a renewable electricity technology. You could also argue it's neither. And the policies that are being put in place have a big social lens on them, you know, in terms of what the benefit could be. So I don't know. I'm looking at Connell's slides here still. I don't know if you can get mine up there, if that's possible. They're very blue ones with SEI logos on them. Sorry about this. Yes, that's them. Yeah, so you can, yeah, so I'm the head of business supports and transport in SEAI, and I cover a lot of the solar area because I have a long background, even ran a rooftop solar company for a while. So if you could go on to the next slide, please. Just to start off with SEAI and kind of yeah, that one, please. Thank you. You know, what are our key goals when it comes to building retrofits? So obviously we're known, and one of our key areas is domestic retrofit. And the key targets within that are improving the energy performance of 500,000 buildings to B2, deploying 400,000 heat pumps by 2030. And that's, if you wish, our North Star when it comes to residential retrofit. And that's what we're gearing up a massive amount of funding and a massive amount of human resources to do. And we've already done 400,000 upgrades to homes around Ireland up until 2021. That figure will be higher now, but we've got a track record of doing this at scale. And as my CEO says, big numbers don't scare us. So we're in that place at the moment. That's homes, but you know, my area when it comes to businesses is other buildings. And we've also got a target, and it's a lesser known target, of 55,000 low emission heating systems and district heating deployment, which would cover both obviously non-domestic and domestic buildings, and to reduce the emissions in public and commercial buildings by 50%. These are our kind of key goals, and driving massive scale in terms of demand and in terms of supply chain to deliver on that is the essential ingredient that we're trying to stimulate at the moment. And if we'll talk about solar then, if we could go on to the next stage and what SEI's kind of are, the next slide please, sorry. What's SEI's being doing and what's our position on this? Well, we've driven the sector in terms of rooftop solar. We've been the engine behind it. I joined SEI back in 2017. And at that time, it's down there on the right, we had 18 registered solar PV installers, and we funded 700 kilowatts of rooftop PV that year. This year, we now have 220 registered solar installers, and we're funding 41 megawatts or 41,000 kilowatts of PV. So that'll give you a sense of the scale and how quickly it's grown. In that time, up until the end of September, we've funded PV on 14,000 homes, 600 businesses. We've installed 120 megawatts funded of solar PV, and that's abated 37,000 tons per annum, give or take. So that's what we're doing. We're doing it actively. We're out in the ground supporting homeowners and businesses, and then we're supporting the policymakers with designing the overall support scheme for this. But within that, what we're trying to do is build a supply chain, make sure that that supply chain is adhering to good standards of quality and installation, and we're normalizing the measure. Back in 2017, this was an unknown. You know, a lot of people might have wanted it, but there was unknowns about who to do it, what the requirements were when they did it, and we've normalized that as a measure now, and you can see that the uptake is enormous and exponentially growing. And with that is a warning, and I'll come back to that in a while. Next slide, please. So then when we talk about, you know, the role for rooftop solar and SEI's perspective on this, I talked earlier about it's not quite retrofit, it's not quite electricity production, but what it does do is it gets buy-in to the energy transition. And that has to be the fundamental objective of rooftop solar deployment. On a per euro of government support per ton of CO2, it's not actually as good as other measures like insulation. So why are we doing it? We're doing it to get buy-in. We're doing it to start to transition people and get that to be their first of many steps in terms of their own energy transformation. And fair payment for export is a fundamental enabler of that. In Ireland, for a number of years, up until this year, as Conal said, we had this unusual situation where if somebody was exporting to the grid, they couldn't get paid for it, except for a small cohort. That was absolutely unfair, and SEAI were pushing and pushing the system for that over the last number of years, and now we have that fair export for payment. And as I said earlier, solar PV is unusual. It will form part of both the achievement of our retrofit targets, but also our renewable electricity targets. So it does a bit of heavy lifting in both areas. So what are we about? We're about making sure that homeowners and businesses can make informed decisions and impactful decisions on their building, and ideally maximizing the depth of energy upgrade that homeowners and businesses do at any one time. We're about the supply chain, and we want a sustainable supply chain. So we don't want the boom bust cycle that's happened in other countries. We want the supply chain that's there today to be still installing solar PV in 2030 and 2040. We want to have decades rather than having 3 or 4 years. We're a massive wallop with this, and then everything is reduced and all of these companies go out of business. We want a sustainable long-term supply chain. And energy efficiency first does underpin a lot of our activities. So in the next slide, just to finish up then, what's the future? What are we looking at? And I suppose, what are the kind of key risks that policymakers at a European and national level should be thinking about? Because we're on the ground, we're learning by doing, we're seeing what's happening with homeowners. So obviously there's a policy around microgeneration support, and I think there's about a 380 megawatt target there. I can confidently state that will be achieved and exceeded given the demand patterns we've seen and the size of the supply chain we have right now, even if we don't scale year on year. And then we have small scale generation support coming for the bigger stuff, the over 50 kilowatt stuff. We've got the export payment now for all, the Clean Export Guarantee, and we're using our grants in a more targeted way at the homeowners and the smaller businesses who need that capital support to incentivize the decision. And we're going around retrofitting 500,000 homes over the next decade. There's a significant opportunity there for the uptake in solar, along with a full retrofit of a building, including a decarbonisation of heat. So the risks, and I don't want to be negative because it's a very positive story, but yes, we talk about PV on every home, but if we do PV only on every home this decade, and that is an absolute risk, we will fail to meet our emissions targets by a country mile. So that is the really important point I'd like to make. Heat is the major national challenge, and low carbon electricity is the foundation for supporting that challenge. But it is really important that we don't have, for example, 500,000 homes put PV on, but only 100,000 put in a heat pump. We will have failed to meet our emissions reduction targets and budgets in that way. So the integration of PV heat pumps and EVs to support the grid is a really untapped opportunity. And again, the supply chain constraint is starting to emerge now. We're starting to see where year on year costs of rooftop solar are going up because the demand is outstripping the supply. And we have to be conscious of that. We can't just double down and say, let's have 20,000 homes next year. All that will happen is we'll deliver the same amount of homes that the supply chain can deliver, but for an inflated price. So that's an important thing to consider. And again, with the import risk, where does the value of this flow? A lot of this technology is coming from outside Europe. We need to be very conscious of that. And that's the final point. This isn't the only renewable we have at our disposal. There seems to be a preference for it within policy in a number of areas at the moment, and I think we should be wary of that. There are other opportunities, and each building should be evaluated on its merits and in terms of the renewable technology that will best work for that use case. So again, I don't want to be over negative, but if we go overly hard on this, there are risks and implications of that, and that we see and we're working with on the front line. So thank you very much, and happy to take questions after.
Thank you, Fergus. You made some extremely interesting and important points. And as you said, you're on the ground, and being on the ground, you know what's happening. And I think I liked your approach that you're going to take it step by step, which is very important. And also the emphasis on what has already been done. 400,000 houses already done. So that's something I think most people aren't probably aware of, and that's a good basis on which to go forward and achieve the targets that you mentioned. So now I will move on now to our last speaker, Barry Caslin, who is an Energy and Rural Development Specialist at TAGASC, the research body for agriculture in Ireland, who do great work like the SEI as well. Barry also has a wealth of experience, and amongst other duties, he coordinates the National TAGASC Farm Business Options Programme, which includes advice to farmers on how take advantage of solar PV. So over to you now, Barry. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sean, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for organising such a very topical webinar, because the amount of questions that are coming in on this whole area at the moment are just phenomenal. So it's great to be able to share that knowledge with as many people as possible. And of course, there's a lot of unknowns there at the moment because this is new to everybody. People are asking questions about, the type of technology they should be looking at. They're asking about, technology providers and what questions they should be asking when they're purchasing such technologies. And such is the level of interest in this at the moment, like with our advisors who are on the ground dealing with the farmers, they want to know what they should be telling them as well. So we've actually put together a 2-day training program for our advisors on the whole area of energy. And I suppose just before I start, if you want to start sharing the slides, or Gillian, you can. But I always say the most important thing that we look at before we look at any renewable technology such as solar PV or anaerobic digestion or heat pumps, we always have to look at efficiency first. So that should be the first fuel on every farm or every business. So a kilowatt hour that doesn't need to be generated, whether it's from a renewable technology or from a fossil fuel technology, that is much better because it makes your business more efficient and the overall profitability will improve as a result of it. So we can just go through the presentation there. I'm just going to focus on we move on to the first slide there. I'm just going to focus on the area of within agriculture itself, and I suppose certainly the dairy sector, the poultry sector, the pig sector, and the horticultural sector. They'd be the most energy-intensive users of electricity on Irish farms. So they're the ones that are really considering this and putting up that technology to help their business and insulate it against increasing electricity prices. The technology itself, it converts energy from daylight and the sun into electricity. It's a very well proven technology, so we're kind of late to the game from a European perspective in terms of deploying this technology, so it's well proven. So the government policy is towards electrifying our heating and our transport, as was described there by the previous two speakers. So we will see more heat pumps in houses in the future. So we will see more electric vehicles outside our front doors. So that's going to require extra electricity. So this is where solar will have an increasing role in the future. With the electricity prices trending upwards, this is where the burning platform is here, and it does work very well in Irish conditions, despite what people might assume to be a cloudy country. The technology has evolved very well over the last 10 years, especially, and the efficiency has improved. Next slide, please. Yeah, so it's very predictable, the kilowatt of electricity that you can produce. And now it'll depend if you're in Donegal in the northwest of Ireland, you'll produce less kilowatt hours of electricity than you will down in the southeast of the country, and that's just down to the daylight hours. The panels should be facing south or east-west. You wouldn't be facing them in a north direction. They can be monitored remotely. They do generate energy in a bell-shaped curve as well. So that really suits dairy farms, especially where you have that calving season from February, March, and it kind of coincides then with the electricity generation from the solar PV as well. And cows are generally dried off in the back end of the year, November, December, and that's when you're at your lowest electricity output from solar PV. So it suits that type of a system. So it's sized so that the output is less than the base load of the farm. Next slide, please. So the sizing is very, very important, that they're not oversized than what you need. We always say to farmers that it's important that they're not putting on too many kilowatts of PV, and that they should look at their current electricity usage and what the demand is on the farm and base their sizing on that. But a typical pig unit, and this is one example in the Midlands, it's a 100 kilowatt photovoltaic system, and that's generating 93,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. Just to put that in perspective, an average house would maybe use 4,500 to 5,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. But that's what a 100 kilowatt PV system would generate. Obviously, at certain times of the year, it'll be producing more in the summertime, of course, and the wintertime it'll be producing less. So this is where you have to look at, is this the technology that suits you best? So that system is generating about 20% of that pig farm's annual requirements. Then if you look at it on your own domestic dwelling house, a 5 kilowatt system will probably meet around 70% of the home's requirement, and surplus electricity can be diverted to hot water, with maybe the balance going to batteries during the daytime and maybe discharging it at night. Next slide, please. So like the batteries, the diverters to the immersion is very, very important on dairy farms as well, because there is that possibility of storing the electricity as hot water, which is needed on dairy farms for hot washes in the morning. So it is possible to do that from solar, and when the cows are out grazing during the day, you're capturing that electricity in the form of hot water as opposed to in a battery. And that's in situations where you're not exporting. To date, the only viable option has been to follow the self-consumption microgeneration route, so meeting your own requirements. A typical solar photovoltaic installation of 100 cow herd of 11 kilowatt would have an investment of €15,300. And that system will supply about 30% of the farm's electricity needs. And it pays for itself in about 7 years at the current electricity prices, and that's without any grant aid. I'll come on to the grant aid after a while, but that system is offsetting about 3 tonnes of CO2 per annum. So it is very easy to measure the CO2 reduction potential of these solar PV arrays on farms as well. Farmers don't get paid for that CO2 at the moment, but who knows, when carbon farming becomes more popular in the future, that we might see payments for that carbon offset as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the base load, most dairy farms use between 2 kilowatt hours and 6 kilowatt hours every hour. So this is, when you're sizing your panels, you can determine it somewhere in between there. A lot of farmers will put in monitoring of their electricity use on their farm to see exactly when, what times of the day they're using most of it. And in some situations, changing the management around, some practices on the farm to coincide with electricity generation. On units which use robotic systems, the base load is going to be higher, and solar PV really suits robotic systems. The key is to size the system so that the electricity is used on the home or the farm, and it may be necessary to divert surplus electricity towards heating and hot water or battery storage. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the standard panels are 1.66 meters by 1 meter, and they're anywhere between 280 to 320 watts per panel, or 0.28 kilowatts per panel. They're improving all the time in terms of their output per square meter as well, just to be aware of that. What we're finding is that the glass foil design that sells between the pane of glass and the foil laminate underneath is very, very important. That you need very robust panels like that, especially in poultry units or pig units where ammonia can be an issue. It's important to be aware as well that there's a performance guarantee and a product guarantee. So when you're asking questions to the supplier, to be aware of, what is the product guarantee, how many years have you a guarantee on it, and what's the performance guarantee or the degradation that you'd expect per year, because it won't continuously produce the output that it produced in year one. It'll go down in output by maybe about 0.5 to 0.7% per year, depending on the manufacturer and the technology that you're using. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there's the option there of putting the solar PV on the roof space of farm buildings, which we have lots of. Obviously, it has to be a supporting roof, so not every roof will be suitable for it. It will have to be able to carry the structure, because obviously there's a lot of money involved in putting it up on any building, and you don't want to put it onto a building that wouldn't be stable. And of course, the microgeneration support scheme is very, very interesting, and this is going to, now the opportunity is there to the Clean Export Guarantee, where you can go to your supplier, whether that's Electric Ireland or Pinergy or SSE Electricity or Bord Gáis. There's a number of them there, and they all have different prices per kilowatt hour that they're offering. So there is that opportunity of exporting back to the grid now. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's just a quick one on the microgeneration rates that were announced probably around this time last year. So there's what's called a Clean Export Premium to the right in orange. That's at 13.5 cents per kilowatt hour. That really hasn't kicked in yet, but what is there at the moment is the competitive market rate, as I mentioned there, of your utility providers, of your electricity suppliers, where you can get a very competitive rate for your exported electricity. You won't be able to get both. You can only get either one or the other, Clean Export Guarantee or Clean Export Premium. The unusual thing that has happened here is that since these rates were announced, that this government tariff of 13.5 cents per kilowatt hour, that has been exceeded by the market rate. So if I was speaking to you this time last year, the market rate was just over 5 cents per kilowatt hour. Now it's closer to 20 cents per kilowatt hour. Next slide, please. Yeah, just the support that's available through the TAMS, which is the Targeted Agricultural Modernisation Scheme, that's funded through Pillar 2 of the Common Agricultural Policy, and that's under the Rural Development Programme. So you can see there the Department of Agriculture in Ireland have put in reference costs for solar PV. So they've costed them at €1,253 per kilowatt installed, up to a maximum of 11 kilowatts for three-phase on dairy farms, and up to a maximum of 6 kilowatts for single phase on dairy farms as well. You can go higher on pig units or poultry units where you're using the electricity yourself and you're not doing any exporting, or you don't have any grid connection requirements. There's also support there up to 6 kilowatt hours of batteries. That grant aid is at 40%, but it was announced in the recent budget that grant aid is going from 40% up to 60%. So that's going to make a massive difference. So that's one of the other reasons why we're inundated with requests about information on solar PV within the agricultural sector at the moment. And some people are waiting for the new cap to kick in and the new Rural Development Programme to kick in to put these panels on at the higher grant rate. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the conclusion here is a final slide. There's opportunities for the development on farms is great, lots of roof space. Even for ground-mounted solar, there's options there as well. Dairy farms that operate spring calving systems produce most of their milk during the summer, which coincides with the production period of solar. And the average herd size has increased from 58 cows in Ireland in 2020 to 90 dairy cows this year. So it's possible to, for most of those dairy farms, they'll probably be using anywhere between 20 to 25,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. So a large demand for electricity on those farms. Electricity prices have continuously fluctuated in recent years, and an increase in electricity prices is in the coming years is likely, because 50% of our electricity in Ireland is produced from gas, and that's why our electricity price is so variable and is fluctuating, and it has fluctuated so much in the last 12 months for all the obvious reasons. Ireland will see an increased shift towards farm use of solar energy. Thank you very much, Sean.
Thank you very much, Barry. Again, that was most interesting, and I'm sure that those following us online will have a lot of questions to ponder on. Now, we are unfortunately running out of time, so I have some questions here, so I'll ask each of our three wonderful panellists one or two questions each. So I'll go back to you, Conal, first, and the two questions I have for you is, what's your view on the planning permission exemptions? I think you mentioned something like 6 panels. What about if somebody can put on 10 panels or more, or it takes in more than 50% of the roof space? You might just elaborate on that for us. And then also
Sure.
You mentioned the restrictions on exports. For individual households now, not farms, but individual households, is there really an opportunity for them to export the excess electricity they create onto the grid and make a profit? Thank you, Conal. Over to you for that question.
Sure, thank you. So yeah, those restrictions on rooftop solar installs in the domestic settings on a house, they've been removed altogether. So your only restrictions are really around distance from edge of the roof and some safety ones in a residential setting. So in a non-residential setting, what has happened, essentially, they've created 43 solar safeguarding zones. So essentially, they drew a big circle around anything that had any sort of aviation presence. So 5 kilometers around a large airport, 3 kilometers or anything like a helipad. And basically, if you have something, if you're a non-residential location located within that, and you're over 300 square meters, you need to go for planning permission. Firstly, we're probably not big believers in the solar safeguarding zone principle, because we don't think they've really, they haven't provided the evidence for this approach. It seems like a hammer to crack a nut. And you get the kind of strange inconsistencies. You could have a housing estate with roofs covered with panels and a big factory beside them going for planning permission and not being able to get the planning panels through that process. So I suppose it's a work in progress, but it's probably when they consulted upon the non-residential requirements, it was 60, so that they've gone up to 300 is probably an improvement. And we understand it's an area that the government is willing to look at again next year with a bit more evidence, a bit more practical experience. On the exports, there are limits within the different schemes as to how much you're allowed to export. Fundamentally, it's always going to be cheaper to use the electricity yourself, consume it yourself, than but export in terms of the way the market rates are working. If your standard rate is, I don't know, say 34 cents per kilowatt hour at the moment, something like that. Your export tariffs are about 17 to 20 cent. So, if you think about it, it's I can make it myself, or I can have it transmitted over the wires to me. So it's always going to be, and then all the costs that entails and losses along the way. So it's always going to be cheaper for me to try and use it myself, maximize the self-consumption. In terms of the difference the export is going to make, I'm not sure it's really going to move the needle in some ways. But I think onto Fergus's point about enlisting people, it was one of the most common complaints about the microgeneration setup in Ireland has always been, I'm generating this and spilling it for free onto the network so that I can get compensated for it. It's an equity point for a lot of people, I think, more so than an economic in many ways.
Well, very interesting indeed. Now, to Fergus, two questions for you, Fergus. One is, we want to see obviously more deployment of solar, but will the increase in solar technologies, will it help to reduce the actual cost of electricity over time? That's because we've seen the rise in electricity prices, particularly recently. And the second question, which I found in your presentation quite interesting, was you said putting on a solar PV led to a buy-in for transition to retrofitting houses and so forth. You might elaborate on where this has happened, and then would you be saying that we should, as policymakers, as a first port of call, try and encourage people to put up solar panels on their roofs, because it won't lead to any disruption within the house, etc. And that then would lead to them saying, oh, I must go further, I must put in a heat pump, I must retrofit, etc. Okay, Fergus, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you. In the first instance, so the main cost reduction on energy costs for rooftop solar panels is the homeowner or business that installs them. Typically a homeowner, given pretty high energy rates at the moment, could be saving, with a small solar system, could be saving 500 to €1,000 a year in their electricity costs. There would be, from an export perspective, that's pretty cheap electricity being exported to the grid, and obviously green electricity. Of course, there's a time element of that where once all solar is installing, if we had a lot of solar installed in a lot of buildings and it was exporting during the day at midday, that will actually suppress the price during the day. Now that'll have two effects. One is it'll make energy cheaper for people who don't have solar, and the other impact it'll have is people exporting all at the same time will get remunerated less, so they'll get less of an export payment. Now that hasn't happened in Ireland yet. On your second point, yeah, it's a really interesting thing. This whole sort of the halo effect of solar. What is it doing in terms? I hear a lot of anecdotal type evidence, and that would be the key point. Is we don't have a very strong evidence base on how this is engaging people. So there's a couple of levels of that. One is, if somebody puts solar PV first, are they more or less likely to do additional measures? There's not a good strong evidence base for that. The second is, if somebody puts solar PV on, are their neighbors more likely to take additional measures? And a key one also is, if somebody puts solar PV in their house, are they more likely to be supportive of solar farms or wind farms in their area or off their coast? They're the three elements of it. So the question you asked me then, Sean, was, should policymakers be promoting solar PV as a first measure? I would say there's a risk in that, because people could say, well, I've made my 5 or 10 grand investment on my building. That's me done for 2030. When we actually need them to do further things, and particularly address the big fossil fuel users in their homes, their boilers, and their vehicles. But you know, at the moment, what we're seeing is there's huge demand for it. So again, from a policy perspective, is there a way of actually trying to get the outcomes that we're trying to achieve in terms of other things like heat and transport, and utilizing the attraction of solar to try and get people, I sometimes call it the gateway drug for retrofit, to try and get people to use that as their first step. But we have to design the policies well to do that, so that we mitigate that risk of them just doing solar and nothing else. And also all of the supply chain, all of the men and women that are going to have to go out and do this work, all going into solar PV, because that's where the policy supports are driving. So it's a fine balance to be made, and you know, it's a very interesting policy point. And if you look around Europe, there's different lenses that have been put on it to date.
Thank you very much, Fergus. Very clear again, and thank you for those answers. And finally, to you, Barry. Again, from a farmer's perspective, you mentioned grants under TAMS for solar panels and batteries. Can a farmer get both together, or is he excluded from one if he does the other? That's the first question. And the second question is, there are massive sheds around all of Ireland on farms. Sometimes they have 3 or 4 sheds, slatted units and places to store hay, etc., etc. Now, is there a limit to the amount of panels they can actually put in those sheds? And secondly, do we have enough solar panels available between now and 2030 to actually meet the demand we would like to see be created? Okay, Barry.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yeah, it's a good question, because an awful lot of people are asking, like, I know the solar developers, they're inundated with requests at the moment for solar PV panels, and a lot of them don't know whether to look left or right at the minute, because whether it's dwelling houses or farms, everyone has the same thing on their mind: how to insulate themselves from increase in electricity prices, and solar PV is an obvious route to do that. I don't know the answer in relation to how much is available, because it's such a global. A lot of our panels come in from Asia, from Germany, and there's competing markets right across Europe for those same panels. So I suppose it's a global supply chain thing. Really, we certainly don't manufacture them in Ireland, so everything is imported. From the perspective of the TAMS and the batteries, and in the panels itself, you can get both. So you can get up to 6 kilowatt hours of battery storage, and you can get up to 11 kilowatts of PV on dairy farms. You can get higher for pig units and poultry units, and that'll be determined by the TAMS upper limit. So there's an upper limit spend in TAMS of €90,000, which it will be in the next TAMS from the 1st of January of next year. Up to now, some farmers have found that they were limited in the fact that they'd already used up their allocation in this current rural development programme period. They might have built tanks, they might have built a shed, and had their TAMS allocation used up. So there was nothing left over to do solar PV measures. In the next TAMS, they're actually going to separate it out. That will be a separate fund for solar PV compared to building works, for example. And that will be a much better step going forward. The farmers' allocation won't be used up that quickly. There is one little issue that farmers, I suppose, are a bit disappointed about, that if they are getting a TAMS grant for putting solar PV onto the roofs of their shed, they cannot sell excess electricity back to the grid, because it's seen as double funding from a double funding perspective.
Thank you, Barry. On that last point, I have been in touch with the Commission about that. And my information is that member states can change that if they so wish. So I think that's something that we have to look at in Ireland, because you're absolutely right, it would make a big difference. And secondly, it doesn't really make sense to say they can qualify under double funding. Okay, that might be a point, but in reality, then are you going to waste an awful lot of valuable green electricity? So I think that's something that we need to address quickly and get solutions for, because we need as much renewable energy as possible. So I think we've come to the end at the moment, because we've run out of time. But I would say to people, if you have questions, to send them in writing, and address them to any of the three speakers, Barry or Connell or Fergus, and we can then get replies for you. Also, I think the presentations were most interesting. If you send an email, we can send out those presentations. I'm sure the lads have no difficulty with that, because they really are very, very informative and very useful for people who will be thinking of going down this line. So I would like to thank our speakers, Connell, Fergus and Barry. You were excellent, you were precise, and obviously knew your particular remit 100%. And also I'd like to thank you for your punctuality. You were online here a good half an hour before we started, so we were able to start on time. Finally, I'd like to thank my own team here for organising this. It takes a lot of effort. Gillian and Emily and Sinead and Liam. And also the technical team here in the Parliament, who are always very helpful and ensures that everything goes smack and smooth without any breakdowns whatsoever. So with that, I thank you again, and I look forward to having our 4th webinar in due course, probably in this field or area generally as well, dealing with climate change and energy, because I'll be representing the Parliament at COP27 in Egypt, and we look forward to that, and we might have some kind of a webinar around that in due course. So thank you very much, and again, thanks very much indeed to our panellists. Thank you.